We are starting the thematic space communication, education, and culture of this 2021 edition of the World Social Forum. All you, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bia Barbosa. I'm a journalist. I'm Brazilian. I'm an activist of the World Forum of Free Media. I'm a representative of the civil society in the managing committee of Internet in Brazil. Today's panel will deal with the collective imaginary. It is a panel that was proposed for CEAL, IPS, Ciranda, Intervoices, IPC, society in the managing committee of Internet in Brazil. Today's panel will deal with the collective organizations who participate in this panel understand that it's impossible to ignore the weight of education and culture in the creation of the collective imaginary. Today, there's an emphasized dispute to be part of the society. So we're going to discuss, we're going to see the parts of this sector in the contemporary industrialized, massified society of today's world that challenge civilizatory values in our democracy as well. At the same time, education and culture are by excellence spaces of social resistance to the strengths that sacrifice the politics. And they oppose the rights, the diversity, the creativity, and knowledge. Our panel will have three parts. First one, we're going to have the guests from different regions of the world, and they oppose the rights, the diversity, the creativity, and knowledge. Looking at the situation, panel will have three parts. First one, we're going to have the guests from different regions of the world, and they oppose the rights, the diversity, the creativity, and knowledge. We're going to be debating. At the end, we're going to have some time for questions and comments that will be done by people who are in the Zoom room and people who are watching via YouTube. We're going to have 2.5 hours of duration. It's a very extensive panel, but it's going to be a rich panel. We're going to, and we'd like debating. Share with At the end, we're going to have some time for questions and comments. Without further ado, that will be done listen to the first guest by people who are in the Zoom room and people who are watching via YouTube of SPPV. We're going to have 2.5 hours of duration. It's a very extensive panel, but it's going to be a rich panel. We're going to, and we'd like debating. Share with At the end, we're going to have your first some time for questions and comments. Without further ado, that will be done listen to the first guest by people who are in the Zoom room and people who are watching via YouTube of SPPV. We're going to have 2.5 hours of duration. It's a very extensive panel, but it's going to be a rich panel. We're going to, and we'd like debating. Share with At the end, we're going to have your first some time for questions and comments. Without further ado, that will be done listen to the first guest by the people who are in the Zoom room and people who are watching via YouTube of SPPV. We're going to have 2.5 hours of duration. It's a very extensive panel, but it's going to be a rich panel. We're going to try and and we'd like debating. Share with At the end, we're going to have your first some time for questions and comments. Without further ado, that will be done listen to the first guest by the people who are in the Zoom room and people who are watching via YouTube of SPPV. We're going to have 2.5 hours of duration. It's a very extensive panel, but it's going to be a rich panel. We're going to try and and we'd like debating. Share with At the end, we're going to have your first some time
Spanish state. a law that was focusing on the commodification of our education, differentiating between students that came from good families and students in a less capable situation from less privileged environments. Further, it was a law that allowed for centres to be subsidized, centres that split genders, which really goes against what we want. School, further than being a meeting place, also hosts teachers, students, and parents. And we need to ensure that we guarantee a proper environment. There was a large amount of mobilization against the law itself, and we managed to actually generate change. And now, not too long, we managed to get rid of some of the more deleterious parts of the law. A law that, unfortunately, is applied in many countries across the world. You know it yourself. Colonialism and patriarchy know no borders. People have to suffer borders, but money or misogyny or colonialists have to suffer from the obstacles of borders. Right now, the OECD seems to be daring to rank countries, but it's an organization that has nothing got to do with education at all. It doesn't understand what the real value is of schooling, which is the attempt to ensure that future generations live better than previous generations. It's to ensure that each child in every classroom can develop their potential. Large multinationals are actually profiting from working classes, and anything beyond profitability is not of interest to them. What we need to do in terms of resistance for education is ongoing and will be ongoing. Right now, we've modified the law. It's a bit better, but it's not what we wanted, really, if we're honest. I believe this was also the pandemic's fault to a certain degree. COVID-19 really exacerbated and brought to the fore, and indeed showed us the aspects that we had not fixed before the pandemic. We had large social gaps between students in our schools, and now this social gap has actually become a digital gap too, because of the situation we have right now. We have the problems linked with women that have not improved and indeed have gotten worse. We're in the front line in many works, our jobs that are considered essential. We still haven't solved the problem of inclusion. Please mute yourself if you are not speaking. We need to ensure that each child can fulfill their potential. From my point of view, there's been one aspect that has been of particular negative effect during this pandemic, and I'm sure we'll delve into this further in the second round, and that's transport. We have not been able to see, rather, we're not able to see proper mobilization. People are not able to go into the streets because of this pandemic, not just in our state, but across the world. We're seeing that there are curfews that are in play. You have to be at home at a particular time. And that's not just the only thing. If there's something we know with this virus, is that nothing can be guaranteed. Nothing is set in stone. And it's more difficult for people now to take to the streets. And if social movements, if schools and transformative schools are not able to take to the streets, then we lose our voice. Governments who may be on our side won't be listening to us They won't be able to hear our voice from the streets because we're not on the streets. In the Spanish state, we have a particular idiosyncrasy. It's that we have two different types of centres of education that are subsidised with public money. One are called concerted centres and others are called public centres. One of them belong to, these concerted schools belong to the private sector, 80% to the Catholic Church, but still the state is subsidising them. And the difference between the student body is abysmal between these centres of education centres. Unfortunately, our government is not going to solve this now either. And this is one of the main big difficulties, unfortunately, that is not going to be resolved. And it hasn't been resolved before the pandemic and only been exacerbated because of the pandemic. I don't want to go over my time limit, but we will continue with the discussion further. Thank you. Thank you very much, Beatriu. We have time to go forward now. And I'm going to go back to speaking Portuguese. I do not understand Portuguese. My colleague will take over.
Thank you very much. We're going to have time to deepen these points.
Você traz reflexões muito importantes sobre os desafios.
More time to deepen this point and think of the scenario. Now, we're going to listen to Oscar Hara, who represents Peru and Costa Rica. He's a sociologist and a popular educator. He's the director of the Center of Studies and Publication of Força, and he is part of the Latin American program of support of the systematization of experiences and president of CEL. Thank you, Oscar, for your presence. You have 7 minutes.
Seu microfone está fechado. Seu microfone está cerrado.
Your microphone is off.
Gracias, Beatriu, por la presentación.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Thank you for your presentation. Colleagues from the Education Forum and the Global Social Forum, a big hug in solidarity and also on behalf of the Latin American Education Association. We ourselves as a movement are trying to contribute to ensure that we have mobilization processes that will transform education, communication, and culture. These are all interrelated. I'm going to try and share my screen with you. I'm not sure if you can give me the green light to do that. So I can just share here. Rosie, could you please allow me to do that? Because on my screen here, it's saying that I do not have the authorization to do so.
Tatiana é co-host, ela também pode te ajudar. Tatiana, você consegue?
Listo, ya se puede.
Ah, bien, gracias.
Oh, great, thank you.
¿Ahora está?
Now?
Sí.
Sí,
Yes, great.
Ya, gracias. Bueno, era para
Great.
de que en los propios 7 minutos, bueno, ya
Just to
me vas a avisar. Bueno, reflexionando un poco sobre
just thinking about this topic, about the pressures that we have from the work that we have done and carried out for working class education, grassroots education, and what we're seeing being incorporated properly in Latin America and in the Caribbean. We're seeing that we have a space for allies that is essential so that we can have a transformative type of education in place. From the educational point of view, first of all, we need to pose a question. This historical moment, which is unprecedented, needs to generate lessons for us. And we need to ask ourselves, what can we learn from all of this? Right now, we're going through a moment in which we're seeing a crisis of the education model in its traditional sense, which is authoritarian, it's vertical, it's very much dependent on the market. And this in turn generates crises. This civilized model, if we don't properly solve what we have to do here, then we're not going to be able to address the specific problems of the crisis, which are linked not just to the education systems, but the way in which we educate. I think we need to look at different dimensions here that are constantly being discussed. Like has been said, we're going through an uncertain time, but precisely because of that reason, we need to really understand that it's time to think. It's time to re-educate ourselves and adapt ourselves to the conditions that we have to go through and face right now. If we don't do that, then we're going to miss out on this historic moment to really radically change and to raise awareness about the large issues that often have gone unseen. Against that backdrop, we need to take a decision that tries to go back to what we had previously, because uncertainty causes fear. And if we fall into that trap, it would be folly. We can't simply think that we can have what we had based on current conditions, but rather we need to take this opportunity and understand that it's time for a transformation. We will be having ethical clash, which is illustrated in policies and pedagogical approaches. This is a radical clash. We have two different paradigms that are at play here. We have the dominant one, focused on the market, profit, individualism, and consummation, authoritarianism, the patriarchy, and in a winner-takes-all type of approach, exploiting the common goods.
Ese paradigma, que es el paradigma
Switching
dominante,
interpreter.
enfrenta con otro paradigma que está presente en nuestras prácticas, un paradigma que tenemos que continuar construyendo, que es un paradigma basado en el cuidado de la vida, basado en la conquista de la equidad en todos los campos, en el ejercicio de la democracia efectiva en todos los campos, basado en una visión feminista.
Based on a feminist view, respecting diversities, and also in a context of love. The crisis of the educational system and of the educational models have to be analyzed in this regard. So we need to know what will be our stance, what is our proposal. In this intervention, I wanted to stress that we have to talk about ethics and how we express ethics through our values day to day. And we have to work so that the ethics are worked into our day-to-day activities. So those of us who work in educational processes, we need to try to raise people that will have these values. We have to be able to teach people who will really bring something good and something positive in their societies. That is our main role. So to finish my intervention, when we talk about education, we don't only talk about the system, we also talk about how we can create spaces where people can learn. Of course, the educational system is not the only system that exists. So we have to defend a public and the free educational system. We have to fight discrimination. We have to fight the market and the capitalist view of education. This is our main role as educators. We have to be able to influence political proposals. We have to fight for the right of education and the right of learning throughout our lives, so that we are able to have learnings regarding all spheres in life, so that we can generate and transform a new world. That's why we talk about Paulo Freire's freeing education, so that we can free ourselves from everything that that constrains us, but also that can free our skills and our capabilities as humans. That's why we have to propose changes in education. That is, of course, what I think my other comrades will talk about. Thank you very much.
Primeiras reflexões que você já trouxe no sentido do papel da educação para transformar.
Thank you very much, Oscar. We're going to use all your reflections for us to talk about, to continue our discussions. Now we're going to hand the floor to the contributions of communication, trying to understand the role of not only the traditional media, but also the digitalized sphere and the process of the construction of the imagination of society and this dispute that is happening here. Our first guest is coming from India, Bhavna. She is senior researcher of IT for Change. She works with online sexist language in the public sphere. Bhavna, thank you so much for your presence here. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Bia. Thank you, everybody, for this opportunity, this forum here. Greetings. Thank you for inviting
me. I'm sorry, Bhavna, to interrupt you. Desculpe te interromper. O seu áudio está pouco baixo. Você consegue aumentar pouco?
Bhavna, your audio is quite low. Your volume, the volume of your audio is quite low. Could you make it a little louder? Maybe speak closer to the microphone.
Por favor.
Let me try.
No.
No, not really.
Okay. 1 second. Yeah. Let me see if this works better. Does this sound better?
Better. Yeah. Está melhor agora.
Yeah, it's a little better now.
Hi. So I'll thank you for inviting me to extend my solidarity with you in this historical moment, as Oscar put it. And I'd like to begin by talking about how last year in May 2020, when lockdowns in India were in place, at IT for Change, we did this small Google Trends analysis around an Instagram incident called Boys Locker Room, a chat group where teenage boys and a few girls shared non-consensual, obscene messages around pictures of underage girls in their circles. And there we observed that along with the rise in the search for the term feminist was a breakout of 5,000% increase in the search for the terms fake feminist and feminazi. Within online public spaces, underlying the everyday interactions that we have, which is a part of our day-to-day, especially since the COVID moment, it can be inferred that misogyny constantly raises its head in the form of these virally amplifying anti-feminist statements, especially in times when feminist voices stand up to assert themselves. From our work on sexist hate speech in online spaces, it is also very evident that the structures of the digital are no exception to real-world patriarchy. These digital structures are built to extend and replicate the hegemonies of contemporary society. And as a result, we see online misogyny having presented a major blow to women's struggles globally and in India. Events in India's recent past affirmed this observation, as we saw in the aftermath of the Indian Supreme Court verdict allowing women's entry into Sabrimala, where an activist who supported this abolition of the prohibition had her house vandalized, was expelled from her religious community, and was arrested for her Facebook posts. 2 years later, a stand-up comic was subjected to death and rape threats, which were delivered to her by, through Instagram and YouTube videos. While a man who was one of the perpetrators of this hate against her, of these rape threats, continues to have a thriving Instagram and YouTube following, despite having been arrested and subsequently released on bail for his clear crimes. The failure of social media platforms to anticipate and respond effectively to the ubiquitous violence and abuse directed at women and femininity, and the dominant culture of misogyny that terrorizes women if they dare to assert their public selves is a known fact now. We know that violence and rape threats are normalized aspects of the online experience. Our own survey that we administered in 2019 demonstrated that survey respondents, young women across South India, reported having experienced gender-based trolling. They had developed coping strategies to survive this reality, and they had also re-socialized their values to be in line with the sexist expectations. They were self-policing their own online presentation, their behavior, and that hate that was received online has a chilling effect on young women's participation and their expression on social media. Nonetheless, while concerns about hate speech are necessary, we must also recognize that there has been a democratization of dissent that we have observed most recently in the past several months as music becomes a language of a farmers' movement against laws that impose globalization from above, and poets and stand-ups emerge from across the hinterlands to rally together as we speak using chat groups and live video channels to lead a movement for justice. In the voice of women farmers in India, echo voices of women protesters from Hong Kong, Chile, Argentina, women organizing and leading from the front, women who are embedded in those spaces but are connected through their collective assertion of a right to be heard, to be present, to be counted. This is not to negate the neoliberal capture of subjectivity under digital capitalism, but it is to show how the structural base of communication in the new digital clearly stands at a crossroads. The policy choices we take now are crucial to the democratic life that we will have in the future. Thank you. That's my time.
Muito obrigada, Bhavna. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bhavna. I think you introduced very well the challenges that exist in this area of digital communication today, and your talk will be well complemented with what Gustavo Gómez will bring to us from the Latin American perspective regarding which are global challenges of how this public sphere has contributed and rights violations, including the freedoms of speech. Now I hand the floor to Gustavo Gómez. He is the Executive Director of the Latin American Laboratory of Regulation, Means and Convergence, with the protection of democracy in Latin America. Thank you very much, Gustavo, for your presence. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Bia. Hello to everyone who's here. It's an honor to be here sharing our perspective and Latin American reality with all of you. Latin America has always had a problem regarding communication. If you see structural conditions um, and um, and you see how communication and freedom of expression works in Latin America, you see that certain people dominate the media, and so it is really hard to enforce freedom of expression. For the social movement has had a huge advance lately. One of the main problems for the exercise of communication is that many people in Latin America does not have access to internet. But once we have internet, we do have this possibility of freedom of flow of information. However,
Não, beleza, então, Bruno. Você já tem o contato direto com o pessoal do Fórum Social, né? Então nem preciso te colocar em contato com a Vanessa. Está tudo resolvido. Então amanhã às 14 horas, você já até mandou um link aqui, né? Revolução e Democracia nas Cidades. Não, beleza, cara.
Social networks are nowadays a public
tudo resolvido, então. Qualquer novidade você me dá um toque. Abraço.
Or these players is of that of gamekeepers. They are now able to regulate the interactions of people. So the potential that internet has as a liberator is now being restrained. The role of companies like Google, Twitter, Facebook can now eliminate information and posts that are of public interest. They can block activists, journalists with no transparency, and they don't allow us to defend ourselves. We can't even have the opportunity to appeal those decisions. When someone eliminates or blocks a post or a profile, for example, in Latin America, we've had a lot of social protests against police oppression. And these companies, for example, Facebook, can block or eliminate the hashtag all cops are bastards. These were, of course, used against for protests against police brutality in Colombia, for example. This was a hashtag used by a legitimate movement trying to fight police brutality, but they blocked it. So these companies enforce laws that exist in the US, for example, copyright laws, and they enforce that in Latin America. And so they use that to eliminate all sorts of publications. I'm sure colleagues that work on this notice that this is one of the main problems in Latin America regarding communication and freedom of speech. This is, of course, only the more evident problem, but there are other problems that are a bit more subtle, more stealth, that still have a huge impact, and that is the capacity of prioritize information. which post do we see first, which post we see later on, and which post we don't see at all. And of course, this is more subtle, but it has an effective impact. So they are silencing public voices and critiques against governments, for example. Of course, social networks are not the only issue. In Latin America, at least, when someone, for example, our children, our students, want to learn about a subject, either about education or just information so that they can form a political opinion, there are not enough sources to look into this. In Latin America, 98% of internet search go through Google. Never in humanity have there been a company with such a power to reduce the access of information over the internet. Never. That is why we need to include in our public agendas the growing role of 2 or 3 international players that end up determining what we're talking about. Who talks and who doesn't. This is the end of my intervention, but I will come back with some proposals about it.
Gustavo, obrigada por ser preciso no tempo também.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. Thank you for being so precise in the time and for your contributions. We're going to continue here in the Latin American region. We're going to listen to Mrs. Bravo. She's Mexican. She's feminist, anthropologist, and social communicator. She works with autonomous digital communication, defending human rights in Latin America. She collaborated with Radio and with community radios of free software. Nowadays, she leads a digital protection program of Digital Defenders Partnership. Thank you, Loreto, for being here with us. You have 7 minutes.
Hello. Hello. Good morning. Greetings from the Southern Horn. I'm in Chile right now. I believe that I myself am a Latin American person. I have roots from Chile, Ecuador, Mexico, from all across the continent. And I'm very grateful for the invitation to participate in this panel on the Global Social Forum, at the Global Social Forum. I'm listening to all the different speakers here, and I'm on the same page. I really identify with much which has been said in terms of this neoliberal capitalist model. In Latin America, it has marginalized large sections of our society. It has hampered them from exercising basic rights, like the right to communicate. And today, in the context of our current pandemic, we see that it's a fundamental right because it's the right that allows for us to access other rights, such as education. What will happen with all these people whom do not have access to proper education, who can't use Wi-Fi, can't use 4G or 5G, and as such, they do not have access to information on health, do not have access to education or to communication in itself, which is of particular disadvantage to them in this current climate. This should be guaranteed by states, but we're seeing it's not being done. Just for instance, in Mexico, for many years now, we have had a telecommunication law that does not guarantee the right to communication for indigenous peoples. Here, I am referring to indigenous peoples who now, because of the state's actions, are not having access to large-scale telecommunication companies like Movistar. These companies in Mexico are not obliged to provide access to the territories where fewer than 50 or 5,000 people live. Just to give you an approximation, we have about 50,000 towns which have fewer than 5,000 people. Therefore, we're speaking about a section of our people that are completely marginalized. They cannot access communication simply because the state itself does not guarantee this fundamental right. Large companies simply say it's not profitable for us to provide these territories with communication because we do not believe that these people have many resources. We see them as poor. These are marginalized, isolated populations. They seem like they come from different cultures. So what happens? Well, these populations, these people, just imagine today, for example, their children do not have access to education. People do not have access to relative cultural information so that they can properly tackle a crisis like the one we're living right now. But what happens then in these situations? Well, people are not able to gain access to education, communication, or many other rights. They're being impeded from doing so. Indigenous people are being affected similarly in many different other areas, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. We're seeing that many territories simply are not connected to mobile networks like urban areas are. The problem here is that people, indigenous people, in Mexico, for example, I will speak about the experience I have had from working with people from the southeast of Mexico in Oaxaca. These people, for a long time now, before colonization, are people that have been governed by local governance based on customs. They have their own communicative assemblies, which allows for them to engage in self-governance, local government, or local governance. And it's there where they're calling for a right that they are entitled to, because the Constitution states so. International treaties also recognize this fact. Therefore, the avenue that indigenous peoples are able to use in order to try and actually exercise these rights has been via autonomy. The importance of being autonomy cannot be overlooked. To be able to adapt to the new needs of the digital world, of the virtual world, but at the same time, an understanding needs to be in place, understanding that these communicative networks must be under the control of the local people themselves. That will allow for them to actually engage in their own self-governance. It's not simply exercising access to communication like urban areas do, but rather it's about how we can ensure that indigenous peoples can self-govern their right to communication. And this is very important because it really links to the concept of autonomy, which itself can only occur if people understand the need for sovereignty, to ensure that people can decide based on their own criteria, their own standards, what types of communication they themselves would like to develop. And not necessarily just receive and do what they're told to do from different external environments. I will leave it there because I've already gone over time. But in the second part, I would like to tell you what these communities are doing in order to actually exercise this autonomy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Loreto. I have no doubt that the experience of these communities is really rich, and it's going to be great to listen to what about they are doing, they have been doing, and all the challenges you brought regarding the large capitalist companies have been violating rights and disputing this imagination of the people by not allowing the access of these people to the freedom of speech. Now, the last guest in this round, we're going to listen to the perspective of the culture regarding the challenges that we have in this dispute of the political and social imagination. We're going to listen to Antonio Herci. He is Brazilian. He is a dramaturgist, and he works in the Museum of Contemporary Art. He organized the International Forum Crossed Frontiers. So Antonio, it's your time now, 7 minutes. Hello, good afternoon. I'm 60 years old. I have fair skin. I have curly hair, curly and gray hair. And my hair is a little messy now. I'm wearing a red shirt, and there are some prints of my daughter's hands on the wall. This is for the blind people to get to know me a little bit. What I'm going to say has already been mentioned because it's a general problem that we face. But I would like to start saying that I need to talk about one of the posts and the member of the deliberative council with the students. So I'm part of the council of MAC, the Contemporary Art Museum. Also, I'm a popular educator. I work in cells and spaces of culture. On the other side of the line of the citizenship. So I have the opportunity to interact with these two contexts. And today, it's hard to believe, and we make the difference of the formal art and the popular art, but it's more or less the same problem. And we have faced this problem for 500 years, which is the colonization problem. This problem remains, and this problem keeps being recycled due to the technologies, with the control of information, control of human rights, and other things. But the problem remains. We keep seeing the same colonization process which started our modernity. So 500 years ago, in the case of Brazil, all the slavery work started. It opened space for all sorts of ethical perversions. So the problem is the same, but in a recycled form. As Deleuze says, it is the same, different of always. It manifests in different forms. So having said that, I think that the biggest problem is if we imagine the things that we buy, that we consume, that we work and produce in the capitalism as a productive system, I mean the line of productions. When we talk about culture, we're talking about everything that is out of it. When we put our feet outside our home, we have the whole framework that we can call the cultural civilizatory framework that people call it ideology. So when we look at the things and we say, it's wrong, it's right, I'm going to pay for my bus fee because it's wrong to jump in the paying area because they're making protests. So these things are serious, and it touches culture deeply. On one side, we have the culture, and we have the museums. That 90% of them are works of white Western men. So the cultural manifestation is starts there. There are other phenomena. There are artworks that portray the black civilization made by white artists, and we don't have the adequate civilizatory conversation. On the other side, we have another type of stereotype, which is we talked earlier about the difficulty of controlling access to information. Now imagine the control of the production of information. If we are saying that most people have no access to our information through computers, etc., in São Paulo, when we talk about inclusive education through technology, is to turn our eyes to this fact, which is the technological inclusion. When we talk about the cultural production, we have a harder problem. When we think of culture, culture is a recent word for us. Before 2006, when we talked about culture, it was like agricultural culture, things that people used to do in the fields, in the countryside. The culture then started to be approached as a phenomenon of human civilization, and it it's seen as something refined, something sophisticated, and it's not something that the civilization builds in their way of life. So this side of the colonization arrives in the peripheral areas, saying that we have a culture to offer you, whether it is by capitalist companies that invest heavily on the market, or the culture of the state. When we reach the communities, the peripheral communities, we say we have culture to offer you. So this approach is extremely wrong, because our treatment is that this culture is a process of introduction to civilization. So how can we go and take it to them? So I think this is the overall context that we live today, which is exactly this context of colonization that creates the surrounded universe for people to enter in an educational process. For example, today, most of the Brazilian people who are excluded of decent education processes, and they get online and they have to accept a whole framework on how to be online and how can I pass to the other grades in school. So all this framework is connected to our existence, our way of thinking, and that's what it causes. I would like to mention an example of how words are expressed. So it's the struggle between two words. In the 80s, when we had the first occupations of the landless workers movement, when they started occupying unproductive farms, because we know there was a large agricultural exodus in Brazil. They had no land, no jobs, and they started having a legit movement of occupation. And this occupation was called invasion for over 20 years. So having the right to say we are occupying this, it isn't a dialogical struggle. So you see that only one word. You will never say that the newspaper Folha de São Paulo call people occupants, and you will never listen to our comrades, our friends from the progressive newspapers call them invaders. So this is the problem. And just to wrap up, a large paradox that the pandemic brought to us, which is the virtual territory. It brought to us, culturally speaking, the confrontation in the linguistic universe that has to be accessible. We cannot use certain derogatory terms. It made us be more aware of the language, to remember the blind people when we talk. So these are challenges that the crisis brought to us. And there are things that we can go back to them in the second round. So Bia and the other dear colleagues, thank you so much. It was an excellent debate. I'm really thrilled with all I'm hearing here. Thank you so much, Tony. And we really wrapped up our talk very well. You could make the connection among the three axes that we are discussing here, and this effort of connection that has to be done to exactly build the resistance to these challenges. So now we can start the second round. We are a little bit late, and it's important for us to guarantee comments and the participation of whoever is here watching us. So I'm going to ask for the panelists that already spoke. In this second moment, you could try to bring your contributions from the resistance within 5 minutes. So we can be a little quicker and guarantee the participation of the other people, all right? So let's keep the same order. So Bia, you first.
Okay, thank you very much. 5 minutes.
Well, 5 minutes. Well,
we can do a lot in
I'm
6 minutes.
To try to make
We've had
some
many things here.
I've heard
some very interesting things from our colleagues here that spoke before me. Oscar also
Você traduziu a sua curva de onde eu tenho feito salvado os flyers da fome, formar em lâminas, sei lá.
We need to understand that we need to act in two different axes. One that's external, and the other is more internal. I'm going to cite Paulo Freire
measures.
So just look at the external
aspects.
I think that right now, all of us
all
who
those
are concerned
who
about
are
education
worried about education
need to have one priority that must be very clear.
Priority,
and that's
which is to
we need to ensure that there are progressive governments, and we need to get rid of fascism from our institutions.
Leave fascism out of the governments all of the world.
Spoken about this word, have we? I don't like to repeat it, but it's essential that we understand
it is very important
fascism is an obstacle to human rights. This has been mentioned because fascism
extremism
implies classism,
is out of the governments because
racism, and dehumanization.
These politics are racist, are homophobes, and we should not be tolerant with them.
In the States, in which we have fascist governments,
those countries where we can find
have suffered persecution.
These kind of governments, we can see how educators have been prosecuted and have been limited in schools. I believe that all education is influenced by politics, so we should not be neutral. We have to act when we face injustice. For example, in Brazil, sadly, you can tell us a lot about all that you've been suffering. What about the internal part? As teachers, we should reflect on our daily work. First off, we have to be aware of our real role. Our role is not theoretical. It's not about coaching. It's not about filling some forms, about giving some figures. It is not about collaborating with enterprises, private companies that pay money so that we continue following the old systems and the old models. So what should we do? Teachers and schools and educators should pay attention to innovative educational models. And I believe that no one should teach without being aware that teaching means loving. we're not here to convey a message. We are also here to learn from each other. Only out of this cooperation, collaboration between the people, we will be able to create a context in which school frees the people. Schools where we can really show children how to think critically, where they can show their diversity. And we can make that this diversity becomes a very fundamental part of our values. To conclude, up to date, school has been a mirror of our society, but we have to go further. And we have to make that schools are the mirror of the world and make them a tool that we use for transformation. We cannot reproduce the mistakes that we conduct in our society. We have to create an environment, a phenomenon where everyone interacts and everyone collaborates and where we are all equal and free. So that's it. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Beatriu, por sua participação acho que esse convite e a esperança que você nos traz ao falar da educação com esse potencial, que acho que os debates sobre a educação no Fórum Social Mundial sempre tiveram esse papel, e é muito importante que você esteja esse ano aqui também trazendo essa fala para a gente. Passo para os 5 minutos de Oscar Hara, por favor.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Abrazos a todas las personas.
Thank you very much. Greetings to everyone who has joined. I totally agree with Beatriu and everything she has mentioned. I'm going to share a presentation with you. And I'm going to share some proposals that at the same time also pose big challenges. These proposals come from our own experience, but they are open. These are challenges that we have to turn into reality. I believe that we have to have an integrative vision of this matter of education, because education is a creative adventure. So we should be able to restructure ethics, politics, methodologies, and we should not see education as something that's instrumental. And of course, it has to be coherent with politics, because at the end of the day, it's all about expression, and there's not a totally neutral methodology. We have to integrate these elements, and I'm going to highlight 3 aspects. Education should be based on democracy and should be also democratizing. It should create environments where we can ask ourselves things, where we can show our diversity and look for answers. And that is very critic with anti-democratic behaviors. And this is where resilience and resistance takes place, where we redesigned another way of living and of doing things. And this is very important. This is something that we should do on a daily basis. Moreover, we should focus on developing all of our human skills, the skills that we have to communicate, to convey messages, to raise awareness, to perceive the problems and to see what lays behind them, to broaden our horizons and be open. Gustavo also mentioned the idea of thinking that territories are broad. And we talk about communities, schools, and we should take them over to build strong democratic relations and to develop our human skills. And last but not least, the preparation of the educators, of the teachers. We teachers can be a burden for society as well if we do not show flexibility for changes. Because sometimes many want to go back to the classical models, they're conventional. So we should be aware of these changes and learn them as well. So we talk in Latin America about making a system out of experiences. So not talking about facts and figures, but being critical. Can learn of our experiences, exchange proposals, skills, and these experiences as well, so that we can inspire each other, so we can motivate each other, and so we can create diverse spaces and to be able to influence politics. We have a program in Latin America to support these aspects, because in our experiences, we can see change. Sometimes we think that change is something that lies in other things, but change lies in our experiences. So to conclude, we have, of course, limits, but a lot of chances. We have limits regarding accessibility, connectivity, technology, property, etc. So we should think about the right to having access to the virtual world to communicate. And this should be a right for all of us, so that we can have access to this digital world. But we have to think also that it doesn't mean that we always have to teach virtually. Using this kind of technology. But we should think about this virtual world as a space, the creative space, where we do not become instruments of technology, of programs that tell us what should we do and how. We should not be pure mediators. We have to take part in these processes and be creative. As teachers, we have to ask ourselves, if we are relating the contents that we teach online to the real life, to the situation and the realities of our pupils, are we really conveying messages? Are we motivating people? Are we making them be curious and have inspiration and to be willing to learn? And we also have to ask us how we can do to create dialogue in groups. And we should take also inequalities and diversity to account. And finally, we have to ask ourselves, are feelings, emotions, art involved in this learning process? Are we including these aspects in this virtual world, or are we just focusing on what they enable us to do? And we should include all these aspects because they have a big role in the learning process. So from SEAL, we highlight the importance of popular education that also show the interest of communities, that make real proposals where we can share power, we can have a democratizing power. And I finish with the idea that when we face an extreme situation, we have to develop tools to face them and use these tools to change everything, because this will create new spaces to change things that we may think that are impossible to change. These are historic changes, historic processes, in a time when we can go ahead and we can have a central part in these changes. From SEAL, we're working with many partners because we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of Pablo Freire. And I will finish with this quote that you can see on screen. We won't have social change if we don't have an education that frees the people. So communication, education, changes, they all go together hand in hand. And we have to create this environment to have hope. We cannot wait. We have to be hopeful, and we have to build this hope with our own hands. So 30 seconds to sing a song, a part of a song from Rosaguiña, that it's called Vamos a hacer lo que será, the seeds of the future.
Juntos podemos todo, juntos podemos más, vamos a hacer lo que será. Fé na vida, fé na gente, fé no que virá. Nós podemos tudo, nós podemos mais, vamos lá fazer o que será. Vamos a hacer lo que será.
Gracias, Oscar. Muchas gracias. Todo bien. Muchas gracias por la... Muito obrigada pela participação musical.
Thank you so much for the musical presentation, and thank you for the contributions for this debate. Now I'm going to hand the floor to Bhavna to bring the experiences of resistance from this perspective in the Asian, where she comes from, and she participates in this panel.
Hi, can you hear me better this time? Okay, great. So thank you so much. That's such a great thing to follow. So, I mean, taking us back a little bit to the somewhat, gritty first round, I wanted to return to talking about how the internet's potential for transformation, as we're all witnessing, has not fully manifested. And instead, we've seen social media platforms to emerge instead as strongholds of hate and conservatism. There is very little pre-existing incentive to neoliberal capitalistic agenda that underlies the algorithms which govern social media platforms to be responsive to feminist imaginations. This leads to media policies that are additionally blind to caste in India as an intersectionality of sexist commentary. which is evidenced in the intentional misunderstanding that is feigned when a feminist hashtag such as Smash Brahminical Patriarchy goes viral. And instead, Twitter aligns with the injured powerful. Dalit lawyers and spokesperson Kiruma Munuswamy is mocked for her dark skin, and it doesn't get taken down. Such commentary doesn't get taken down. Xenophobia and Islamophobia and its local flavors emerge as hashtag rice bag convert and Corona jihad, and these continue to be allowed to go viral across Asia. Ephemeral solidarities that are facilitated by technology are weaponized instead to silence and derail these solidarities. A new generation of young women, of young people are emerging who self-discipline themselves to negotiate this fluid public-private, who are now adapting themselves to the normalized hate, to retain access to the public-private. And it has given a new lease of life to ideas that we had thought we had left behind in the previous century, that we had hoped we had left behind, a new masculine that is now overt and it terrorizes women and those who are marginalized for daring to seek public presence and participation anew, for daring to claim access to the full range of human possibilities. So as I had asserted a short while back, we are again standing at this crossroads where the policy choices that we make about the governance of the digital become crucial to what our lives in the democracies will look like in the future. And it is very necessary that we engage in these policy processes with hope, because there is the possibility of change through our resistance and through our engagement. And an evidence of this is how just a few months ago in November 2020, the southern Indian state of Kerala introduced a broad law to criminalize offensive speech. And the state, this is something that we've been demanding for a while. So there's that spark of hope that's trying to take some sort of seriousness, in its response to misogyny that is all pervasive. The state brings in this somewhat undercooked law, and when it is criticized by civil society voices that point out the dangers of such a far-reaching draconian provision that will govern digital communications, and that did not emerge from processes and methodologies that included women and marginalized communities in its conception, the state rolled back its decision. And that was in itself a moment of joy through this struggle. And so I, want us to, in these moments, perhaps hope that we can respond to this moment of critical, this critical moment of having to make these policy choices. Some questions that can help us, make better engagements with the demands of the future. And we ask, what are the limits to behavioral data extraction and processing? What is the kind of algorithmic nudging that we are okay with? What is the ethical and moral and legal delimitation of what data can and ought to be used and for what purposes? We ask, is the design of the social media that we are using distributed and federated? Is it responsive to local contexts? Is it following de minimis requirements that are set with the participation of and the best interests of the communities where their users are embedded? We ask, when the balance between freedom of expression and the freedom from violence is re-articulated in a digital context, it is important to ask, is the content governance model that is being implemented founded within constitutional ideas of rights and justice? Is there a redressal mechanism that is available, accessible? Is it being instated in a way that makes it publicly accountable? Or is it in the clutches of the private? Is it in the clutches of the same forces that are seeking to trap us within this new this unnegotiable digital? And finally, we ask each other, how do we build this global treaty on cyberspace? How do we evolve data and algorithmic justice? Because it is necessary and important to create accountability structures that can conduct algorithmic audits and that can create protocols such as how do we bring a human in the loop for these decision-making processes? How do we involve humans when we are trying to use automated filtering protocols for proactive filtering of content? We need a new binding global framework for social media, which is grounded in human rights, that we recognize that human rights that recognize efforts to build frameworks through guiding principles that have served us over the last century, and we move away from a sort of a voluntary mechanism for some sort of freewheeling world of loose liabilities. And instead we create binding statutory mandates. It is necessary for us to ask each other and extend to each other these solidarities as we build this new treaty and build this new world that can emerge through the ashes of this moment. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Bhavna.
Thank you so much, Bhavna. I think that Gustavo's talk now, talking about the experiences that we have built in Latin America, will talk a lot with you brought, which reinforces the challenge that we have to make this struggle, transformation and regulation of the platforms, the monitoring of algorithms, and how they influence in the expression of people, and it becomes a global struggle. I think that's going to be great for us to use this panel to connect Asia and Latin America in this fight. Gustavo, it's your turn now.
Thank you very much. I would like to propose three things that link to what people have said. First of all, I think Loreto is fully in the right here. We need a proposal of a strategy so that we can call upon states that they then guarantee internet access to all people in Latin America, to everyone indeed, because it's an obligation that states must adhere to. If there's no access to internet, then there is exclusion. There's exclusion from public spaces, from education, from access to culture, as well as proper participation in society. This is cross-cutting, I believe. Minimum access, so that access to other rights is facilitated. Secondly, I believe, like said, we need to ensure that we need to have a parallel state. Well, we need to understand, rather, that we have a parallel state that is dominated by few who seek their own forms of justice that determine flows of information. We in Latin America, together with different organizations in Latin America, have drafted a number of proposals so that democratic states can limit the power of large platforms when it comes to content modification. I think it would be a good input for you, because we believe that civil society in Latin America, but across the world too, needs to have a strong voice, putting forward proposals on the global stage on these issues. If not, we're going to stay behind. We're going to see self-governance of companies that will not be in line with proper regulation from states or in line with authoritarian approaches from states. We need to put forward an alternative proposal, because platforms they themselves are already on their own path. I'm going to share our proposals here in the chat to save some time. This is not an extensive document that I'm speaking about here, but it's a very concrete, specific document that really sets out what needs to be done so that we can ensure that we have liberty online. I'm going to have a number of links here in Spanish, Portuguese, and in English so that everybody will be able to get to know the proposals that we have. Thirdly, and lastly, I like what Oscar said. I want to echo it. I believe this idea of empowering internet users is a good idea. Like I said, not all of us have access, but if we can ensure that most people can have access to internet, we need to ensure that users must be empowered so that we can call upon governments, but so they can also tackle private regulation. In doing so, to do so, we need to inform them. We need to ensure that they can get involved in processes. They need to understand that we are the owners of our own histories, that we're free to use internet. And this cannot be infringed by any type of business models or business or government approaches. Like I said, I'm going to put a number of our proposals in the chat here. We work with journalist associations too, and other associations that work on a campaign called Two Different Rights on Internet. I'm going to leave it in the chat, like I said, so I don't have to overrun the time. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be here and speak with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. We're going to have all these connections done. And there are suggestions in the chat that some of these proposals should be taken to the Global Articulation Assembly that will happen at the end of this World Social Forum. I think we can take these concrete proposals to this discussion to an audience that is bigger than the one that is here with us. Now, please, Loreto, it's you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bia, and I completely agree with what you said. I love what Oscar said. I like what Freire mentioned too. In the feminist movement, we are speaking here of future-topias. We're speaking about how we can dream about this future that we want. How can we build, together with other people, ensuring diversity, how can we build these futures that we're thinking about? In this context, like said in the first part, indigenous people have indeed taught us many lessons when it comes to technological sovereignty. In the southeast of Mexico, indigenous peoples, Zapotecos mostly, not all, Mixtecs too, have decided that considering that the state is not able to guarantee the right to communication for all peoples, well, they decided to exercise their right to communication by setting up their own community mobile networks. Ensuring that these communities are the owners. This is a pioneering project. It has its roots in radio communications, which is another way of ensuring communication sovereignty. There's a long history here in Latin America. Against that backdrop, today, how are we going to speak about digital rights of indigenous people who do not have access, for example? If they do not have access to the internet, it doesn't mean they don't have the rights that are associated with the digital landscape. We all that we are connected or not because of our governments or other companies not allowing us to have that access. that's besides Zoom for these global forums of this magnitude to speak about alternatives when we are aware of the fact that this is a company that is carrying out data extraction. So we need to really ask ourselves what's going on. We need to stop having a type of large companies to overshadow alternatives, because that's not the only way to meet using these companies' platforms that are extracting our data. We're fighting against mining extractivism, water extractivism, and cultural extractivism. We who have access to the internet need to be able to fight against this type of data stealing that is occurring. For me, this has been a perfect example. Rather, what the Oaxacas did has been a perfect example. I liked what they've done. They didn't ask for anyone's permission. They simply did what they did that would lead to a reforming rather, of laws that were in place that would ensure non-profit networks being set up. On the same vein, indigenous people today are pioneers here, creating the first non-profit mobile network, which allows for connectivity, and that will soon be using data. But again, the indigenous people are the owners here. They're not going to steal data, but rather, again, we need to look at what the data will give in return. There's a different approach at play. We should look at what companies have given us. Those of us who have not had access to proper education, for example, we need to see how we can instrumentalize and use what we can to help us where it's convenient. We need to look at who has access to our data, what's being done with this data. We want the youth of these populations, these peoples, to have access to platforms like Twitter, for example. We're seeing these platforms being used in a negative manner, though. Facebook is spreading abuse, for example. Indigenous people are really teaching us a lesson here when it comes to exercising rights and questioning, understanding that not everything that glitters is gold. And like this wonderful black feminist Audre said, understanding this, we need to understand that we need to create our own communication methods. And this is being discussed in nearly all Latin American countries. We have community networks, rather, be that access to the internet or telephone networks. They're in Colombia, Ecuador, and Brazil. They're in Central America, in Mexico, of course, too. So right now, we're really facing a movement that is working from the bottom up. They're creating an alternative internet that is not linked to big-scale companies that are stealing our data. Sorry, I didn't set a stopwatch here, so please let me know when I need to finish up. Yes, if you could finish up. Okay, no problem. But I think what's important today is that we need to really ask ourselves, how can we exercise our digital autonomy? What are our digital rights? What indeed are we doing right now? At this time, when we're using these companies that are really feeding this capitalist neoliberal system, they have us in a terrible situation. We're facing an awful climate change crisis. All of us online, we are all contributing to the climate change disaster too. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Loreto. Now we're going to ask Herci, Antonio Herci, for your final 5 minutes. I don't listen to you, Bia. You can hear me, right? So when we say, can you hear me, or are you listening to me? I think this is the sentence we most spoke last year. So the people who spoke before me, I love what you said, and I'd like to just go back to a point, which is a central point, the point of the autonomy of creation. It's not only access to the network, but what people do in the network, not to make people passive consumers of something, which will make internet a new unidirectional TV. So it can stop being an interactive process as we imagined in the 90s, and it will become a monopolized system by companies that control the information system. I think it's already happening, actually. So the first thing I would like to say is, I believe that we should not consider the naturalism. What do I mean by naturalism? I personally, when I was facing the crisis, I thought our ideas not save the world. I mean, if you think that good ideas against racism, misogyny, colonization are the people change structural rights, including the rights to culture and education, they are virtual. To access these rights, we need to have money, lawyers, people to defend us. However, the prison, the contention of our bodies is effective. If you are protesting in a line, in a queue, you can get arrested right away. If you are complaining for rights, you will take years to receive the rights. So if we think of trying to change this situation, we have to think of 2 points. We, people who are in the front struggling, we are in the institutional means, and we are in the social movements. We can see that people in the activism, they are in distinctive roles. When you are in the institutional place, we need to think of the struggle against colonization, for the authorship, for the spaces, for the acquisition of artworks, and the guarantee of spaces such as theater rooms for people to access. However, when we are in another front, the popular activism front, I remember something that Paulo Freire mentioned. It's not only in education. We need to have the autonomy of people. So I would like to say that we need to create these mechanisms. The basic rights for physical accessibility. And today, we are just fighting for survival. People need to be isolated, and they need to survive. So it is a problem of society. It's not only a problem of the unemployed people. So we have to give not only the access mechanism, but also the possibility for people to create. And I like to remember Paulo Freire. There's a quote in one of his books, which is, education as the practice of freedom. In culture, we can paraphrase this quote. We can say that culture is also in this registry. But we, the activists, the culture producers, apart from the practice of liberty, We need to think of the content that we produce and we broadcast.
Muito obrigado, Bia, mais colegas. Estejam bem. Um abraço.
Soyez bien, je vous embrasse à tous et à toutes.
Muito obrigada, Antônio. Eu acho que o microfone, tinha alguém que estava com o microfone aberto, alguém da tradução.
Deu uma vazadinha.
Foram desconectados.
Só, desculpa, só encerrando de novo, que eu me confundi com as várias vozes. Eu queria dizer que essa é a grande luta mesmo, acho que na cultura, na educação, na comunicação, que é a acessibilidade, que é um instrumento, e é também a autoria, a meta-autoria, que as pessoas têm como expressão identitária, expressão de si própria, que não pode ser relegado, ou seja, a luta não é só pelo acesso, é por essa autonomia na produção. Muito obrigado, gente. Boa tarde.
Muito obrigada, Antônio. E eu queria compartilhar com os panelistas aqui que a gente tem um riquíssimo debate acontecendo no chat aqui, em paralelo à nossa conversa. Fiquem à vontade para reagir também e trazer as suas contribuições. Nós vamos passar agora para a terceira rodada do nosso painel de hoje e vamos trazer 3 ricas contribuições a partir de ativistas, defensores de direitos humanos, educadores, comunicadores que estão nos territórios fazendo essa resistência por outra comunicação, outra cultura e outra educação possíveis. Então, gostaria muito de convidar para essa primeira contribuição o Barka Ba, que vem da Palestina, é diretor do Centro Criativo de Teatro e presidente da campanha global pela educação. Barka Ba, muito obrigado pela sua presença, por estar conosco aqui desde o início deste painel. Você tem 7 minutos.
Thank you, Bia. I didn't hear your introduction because I didn't put the translation. In any way, I heard most of the speakers, and thank you very much for all of your input. From someone who works in education, not just at regional level, but also at international level, let me say that the problem is much more than in the school. The problem is at large level. This pandemic, actually, it shows the fragility of the educational system, the health system, the social protection system. You can see, I think, here or in Latin America or in Africa, 60% from the people, they didn't have access to the digital education. And even we discovered that all the policy that has been set up by the governments in order to run the education was empty from justice, because most of the policy they didn't take in their consideration when they try to put the system for the learning distance. They didn't thought that there is millions of people, they don't have, as you mentioned, computers, or they don't have access to internet. Even not that, there is some areas which there is millions in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America. They don't have electricity in their country. The infrastructure of their villages, the marginalized people, is less than the minimum. And we, as activists, we discovered that we didn't see this also. We didn't see that millions of people that still live in a human condition. All these policies in all over the world, including the international organization, including the UNESCO, the UNICEF, all these organizations, when they put their policies, they didn't really understand well the culture of the people, the economic background of the people, the poverty that some of the people live in. There is some people who live in $1 or $0.50 per day. There is millions of women who live on daily basis. When the pandemic came, they lived without nothing. So, and at the end, they ask us to divide our struggle. Those who struggle for education, different from those who struggle for health, different from those who struggle for social protection, for economic. This is, I think, the capitalists, they put us historically in this division. Those who work in education, how we can secure the access of the education if the people healthy is dangerous. If the people, they don't find something to eat. Why we push the people to have access to the education while at the same time they don't have something to eat? We have to rebuild again our strategy. We have to work as a comprehensive struggle. We don't have to divide always education from the health, from the social protection, from the others. So we have to come and to look at the comprehensive picture. South, east, south, north, east, west, education, health, social protection. Like we have lost in this issue without really a strong networking among each other. Look at the competition that happened among even the civil society, even among the social movements, that each one, he thought that he has his interest and he fight without looking at the other. So we got lost, and I think this division came from the capitalists. It's very easy to control the people when each one, they are care about what he is caring about. And in this pandemic, actually, it shows the fragility of the concept of the solidarity at the national level, at the regional level, at the international level. All of us, we were caring about ourselves. We stopped to speak with our neighbors. Even if our neighbors, we hear that he have a virus, COVID-19, we close our doors. The country has been closed. All the country, they start to care about their selves. Look what happened in Italy, in France, and even in Europe. But also this pandemic, it shows the injustice in this world, the huge gap between the South and the North when you speak about digitalization, the access, and using the technology for that. The poverty in our region, in the Middle East, there is challenging that we are facing and we are trying to overcome. One of these challenges, I think it's in Latin America, you can find, and it's the education. We have this debt, what we call it, the debt on the shoulder of the government. You imagine that most of the countries that they have debt, from the debt they have from the benefit. For example, Sudan, if they have 1 billion for the World Bank, they pay 197% from the debt as a benefit to the World Bank. So this country will not reach the minimum of SGD4, what we call the education goal, with this debt. It means that most of the countries, even in Latin America, in Africa, is disaster. So half of the world has been owned by the World Bank and the other banks. So what we are doing, we are slaves. And what does education do? If the education just, if we don't use the education to change ourselves, then what's the role of the education? Now they're trying to push us to deal with the education as a victim. The education is never been victim. The education should be the solution to change our situation. This leads us to another things internally. We have to fight corruption. If we want really to achieve what we call the educational goal, SGD4, which is mean equality, comprehensive, equity, quality, long life learning, all these things. We cannot achieve this without having, for example, a tax justice system. We have to fight the corruption that exists in our countries, and by also this corruption is not fighted by the international countries. They support the dictatorship regime, and they support the corruption by using many tools in order to fighting all the democratic movements, even the social movement, even the World Social Forum. All of you know that has been recently fighted by the international donors, and we were afraid that it will be in the blacklist. They don't want this kind of alternative view, alternative struggle for all of the injustice system in this world. I will back to the things that we cannot solve the problem, the crisis of education, if we just look at the school, at the teachers' problem themselves, at the individual country. We have to work as a movement. We cannot solve the problem by having small activity here and small activity there. You cannot solve the problem if you train all the teachers. You have to. We can solve the problem if we have strategized our struggle as a global movement, and we have to go back to change our strategy. We have three choices: either we die quickly, or we die slowly, or we have to change our strategy. We have to localize our advocacy. We have to go back on the ground and to mobilize the people who has been affected by the crisis, who has been affected by all this capitalist policy, who has been affected by the pandemic. These people, they have to be aware about their crisis in order to really to stand up again to struggle. We have to mobilize, to popularize our struggle. Otherwise, we will not be able to succeed if we kept just in closed rooms and with the elites. I don't disvalue the importance of creating tools in the school. I disvalue the ability to have really a good infrastructure in the schools. This is something else. But what I am saying that we cannot solve the crisis if we don't have a vision about what we want to achieve in this world, which is the social justice. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Refá, pelas suas reflexões e pela sua indignação. Eu acho que é muito importante a gente sentir isso também no momento das reflexões, porque isso também nos faz querer sair do lugar e nos movermos, né, para transformar essa realidade. Muitíssimo obrigada pelas suas contribuições e sua pura perspectiva a partir da Palestina, que é um lugar que tanto tem a nos ensinar do ponto de vista da resistência e que nos ensina tanto nesses últimos 20 anos de Fórum Social Mundial e de luta global. Passo agora a palavra, então, para Barka Ba, nosso convidado do Senegal. Ele é jornalista e pesquisador em ciências políticas, diretor do Observatório Periódico do Senegal e diretor de informação do TFM, primeiro canal de televisão do Senegal. Muito obrigada, Barka Ba, pela sua presença. Merci beaucoup. Você tem 7 minutos.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce que le son est bon? Vous m'entendez bien?
Oui, c'est très bon.
Très bien. Donc, je suis très heureux de rejoindre ce panel. Et c'est un grand
Par contre, vous ne voit pas.
Oui, malheureusement, j'ai un problème avec ma caméra. Je l'avais signalé au début.
D'accord.
Après, je vous enverrai mon photo, Inch'Allah.
D'accord.
Je suis vraiment désolé. C'est la caméra qui ne fonctionne pas.
C'est bon.
Donc, je vais essayer de parler un peu du panel qui me concerne, c'est-à-dire comment maintenant les stratégies d'influence influent sur les imaginaires politiques, et plus spécifiquement dans le continent africain. Alors, en espérant que je ne parle pas trop vite pour ceux qui font la traduction. Alors, pour aller très vite, comme le temps est court, l'ingérence en ligne est une nouvelle menace qui pèse sur un nombre croissant de démocraties en période électorale. L'élection présidentielle américaine, le vote du Brexit ou le référendum catalan en Espagne sont autant d'exemples qui nous renseignent sur ces stratégies d'influence de plus en plus récurrentes pour influer sur les imaginaires politiques au moyen des réseaux sociaux que sont Facebook, Twitter, Instagram ou l'application WhatsApp. On sait depuis Clausewitz que la politique est la poursuite de la guerre par d'autres moyens. Par les bouleversements qu'elle implique, l'utilisation des technologies numériques est comparable, à mon avis, à ce que l'invention de la poudre à canon a représenté dans le passé pour s'assurer une suprématie dans la conduite de la guerre. L'Afrique aussi, mon continent, n'est pas en marche, car on a pu noter dans certains pays, surtout en période électorale, de véritables stratégies mises en place par des officines pour essayer d'influer sur le cours des événements. À ce sujet, pour moi, il y a une référence, c'est le scandale Cambridge Analytica. Pour rappel, Cambridge Analytica, pour ceux qui l'ignoreraient, c'est une enquête fédérale qui a été ouverte aux États-Unis après les soupçons d'une ingérence russe pour favoriser l'élection à la présidence de Donald Trump. Mais c'est surtout ce scandale Cambridge Analytica qui a constitué un vrai séisme. Cette société est accusée, pendant l'élection américaine de 2016, d'avoir utilisé des données de 30 millions à 70 millions d'utilisateurs de Facebook recueillis sans leur consentement, en passant par un quiz développé par un universitaire anglais et sa société Global Science Research. Ce scandale a conduit le patron de Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, à devoir s'expliquer sur de telles pratiques et de prendre ses distances avec cette société. Beaucoup d'observateurs pensent que Cambridge Analytica a pu favoriser l'élection de Donald Trump. Pour ce qui concerne plus spécifiquement le continent africain, en mai 2019, Facebook a déclaré avoir bloqué 265 comptes, pages, groupes et événements de son réseau social et d'Instagram. Ces pages s'activaient surtout en Afrique, principalement au Nigeria, au Sénégal, au Togo, en Angola, au Niger et en Tunisie, ainsi que dans d'autres pays d'Amérique latine et en Asie du Sud-Est. Les personnes à l'origine de ce réseau ont utilisé de faux comptes pour créer des pages, diffuser leur contenu et influencer les politiques dans ces pays. Ces comptes n'ont pas été supprimés en raison de ce qu'ils disaient ou de qui les avait créés, mais en raison de leur comportement qui visait à tromper les utilisateurs, a précisé Nathaniel Gleicher, le responsable de la sécurité de Facebook, lors d'une conférence de presse. Suivi par quelques plus de 2 millions de personnes, ces 65 comptes, 161 pages et 23 groupes ont, durant 7 ans, diffusé plus de 700 000 € de publicité politique. Le chiffre est énorme, 700 000 €. Mais les deux pays qui ont suscité dernièrement le plus d'inquiétude concernant des tentatives de manipulation des imaginaires politiques sont deux États particulièrement fragiles et instables. Le Mali et la République centrafricaine, où deux États puissants et étrangers, en l'occurrence la France et la Russie, se mènent une sourde bataille d'influence. Le réseau social américain a supprimé plusieurs dizaines de comptes, donc Facebook a supprimé plusieurs dizaines de faux comptes dédiés à la promotion de la politique étrangère française et à la critique de la Russie. La campagne ciblant le Mali et la République centrafricaine aurait été menée par des individus associés à l'armée française. Les tentatives de manipulation du débat public donc, sur Facebook semblent s'intensifier sur le continent. Un des responsables de la politique de cybersécurité du réseau social américain a annoncé que son personnel avait démantelé 3 réseaux de comptes, groupes et pages de réseaux sociaux qui avaient diffusé des rumeurs ou de fausses informations de matière coordonnée et au nom d'entités étrangères ou gouvernementales depuis 2020. Voilà, je m'arrête là en attendant que je puisse m'avancer un peu pour les solutions.
Muito obrigada, Barka Ba. Para nós é muito relevante ter uma contribuição a partir não somente do Senegal, mas do continente africano. Você trouxe essas resistências que estão sendo construídas em diversos países da região, e, sem dúvida, são laços que precisam se fortalecer com as outras regiões que estão representadas aqui também no nosso painel. Então, muito obrigada pela sua presença. Nós vamos agora para a nossa última contribuição, última, mas não menos importante, para a minha conterrânea de Brasil, nossa admirável lutadora, Célia Maracajá, do Amazonas, uma região que, no momento, no Brasil, além de todos os desafios que sofre pelo desmonte da política ambiental pelo governo Bolsonaro, também sofre gravemente os efeitos da Covid-19 aqui no Brasil. A Célia Maracajá está conosco desde o início desse painel, ela é atriz e cineasta, faz parte da coordenação fez parte da coordenação do primeiro e do segundo Fórum Social Panamazônico, que aconteceram em 2001 e 2002, e da coordenação também do terceiro e do quarto Fórum Social Mundial Panamazônico, que aconteceram na Bolívia. Foi coordenadora cultural, foi coordenadora cultural da edição de 2009 do Fórum Social Mundial, que aconteceu em Belém, aqui no Brasil. Célia, muito obrigada pela sua presença e pelas suas reflexões. 7 minutos para você.
Bom, boa tarde a todos. Eu quero saudar todas as companheiras e os companheiros que nos veem, que nos escutam. Agradecer muito por esse convite. Eu estou falando aqui de Belém do Pará, território amazônico, onde todas as emoções se encontram, assim como as nossas grandes águas, porque nós estamos agora aqui no período do inverno, ou seja, a chuva é presente todos os dias em nossas vidas. Eu vou falar do ponto de vista do meu ofício, que é o teatro e o cinema, onde estão presentes e que reúne a comunicação, a educação, a cultura. Começo dizendo que o mundo está sob a vigência de uma ditadura invisível que busca homogeneizar a humanidade dentro de padrões de controle e submissão, abolindo toda e qualquer diversidade. Na Amazônia, os povos indígenas enfrentam hoje um genocídio que tem um lado material, com o aniquilamento das pessoas, e outra imaterial, que é a destruição de nossas culturas originárias. A franquia do acesso de grupos pentecostais a povos em isolamento voluntário, viabilizado pelo atual desgoverno brasileiro, é só uma parte de um plano que visa exterminar os territórios, matando de uma vez povos e suas culturas. Por isso, a afirmação dos povos e culturas originárias passa necessariamente por um duplo movimento. De um lado, fazer incidir nossa cultura sobre a sociedade envolvente e, ao mesmo tempo, estabelecer filtros que nos protejam dos aspectos mais nocivos do modo de vida da sociedade neoliberal. Fazer ouvir a nossa voz é uma questão de sobrevivência. A afirmação da presença indígena na política, na cultura, na educação, nas artes, é uma forma de romper essa invisibilidade, enfrentar os preconceitos que buscam justificar a nossa destruição. Nesse sentido, tem particular importância as experiências de apropriação da tecnologia audiovisual, aí eu vou falar um pouco mais do meu campo, com a formação de centenas de cineastas nas aldeias e a produção de um cinema indígena, com um olhar próprio e diferenciado. Essas experiências nós consideramos assim fundamentais para a permanência de nossas tradições, particularmente nossos idiomas, mas também para a afirmação de nossa maneira particular de estar no mundo, de nos alimentar do imaginário, da criatividade, estabelecendo pontes entre o passado e o futuro, Por outro lado, a pandemia tem mostrado de forma exemplar a necessidade de deter a invasão de garimpeiros, madeireiros, pastores evangélicos nos nossos territórios, como uma questão de sobrevivência física e da cultura. Nada é mais eloquente que a experiência dos parentes do povo Zoé, aqui no oeste do Pará, que estabeleceram um verdadeiro auto-isolamento voluntário, com rigoroso controle para o acesso às suas comunidades, com desinfecção de aeronaves, e todos os insumos que lá chegavam, e com isso eles lograram não ter nenhum óbito, nenhuma transferência para o hospital, ou seja, na verdade, nenhum caso do Covid-19. Isso foi exemplar no território desses povos, dos parentes Zoé, no oeste do Pará. Nossa existência, a gente pode dizer assim, vem de longe, né? E a toda hora ela se recria, se reinventa. Por exemplo, como os boraris e os arapiuns, que são outros povos que vivem ali na região também, na região de Santarém, no oeste do Pará, e que agora estamos assistindo o renascimento desses povos que sempre lutaram contra os colonizadores, no século XIX, especialmente, ao lado aqui dos muras que habitam o Alto Rio Negro, e outras etnias dessa região aqui do Pará, onde tiveram uma participação destacada na grande revolução dos pobres amazônicos, que foi a cabanagem. A cabanagem, que foi esse movimento que juntou todos os pobres, os indígenas, os negros, os pobres, os descalços, aqui em Belém, em 1835, que se estendeu até 1840 e chegou até o Amazonas. Durante séculos, foram proibidos de falar suas línguas, foram desaldeados através das famosas descidas de índios, palavra dos colonizadores, colocados sob o controle de ordens religiosas, no esforço persistente para aniquilar suas identidades. Nesse aspecto, o renascimento desses povos indica para o mundo a força de uma maneira de estar no mundo, baseado em valores como a solidariedade, o coletivo, a liberdade. É uma prova contundente da força dessas ideias que lutam contra as trevas e são pela resistência das vidas, de nossas vidas e do planeta. Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada, Célia, por esses séculos de resistência e por levar essa resistência também para o campo da comunicação e da cultura, que você também representa aqui nesse nosso painel. Nós estamos terminando a nossa atividade, a gente tem alguns minutos ainda, convido todos e todas a lerem o chat também aqui, das pessoas que estão na sala no Zoom, porque tem um debate bastante interessante acontecendo aqui. A gente vai ter alguns minutos para alguns breves comentários da audiência e do público, então, se alguém tiver interessado em fazer um comentário e trazer sua contribuição aqui, pode se inscrever aqui pelo chat, que eu vou chamar o nome dessa pessoa, e aí a gente pode abrir o microfone, se tivermos comentários de pessoas que queiram fazê-lo. Se preferirem escrever, a gente também pode fazer a leitura daqui, e todas as contribuições que foram feitas aqui pelo chat também ficam salvas aqui como o nosso registro da nossa atividade. Alguém quer começar?
Posso?
Sim, Rita, por favor.
Um brevíssimo...
Um minuto.
Um brevíssimo comentário. Eu acho que esses três setores precisam, de fato, dialogar mais, porque estão trazendo uma visão de como se processam as interações e a produção, né, do pensamento, do conhecimento e da relação com a nossa realidade. Acho que no Fórum Social Mundial, juntar esses três setores foi um acerto, só que é um acerto ainda inicial, esse é um desafio que está sendo colocado, né? Acho que há coisas que, de um lado, que devem ser dialogados diretamente com o outro, como o fato de que, através das escolas, da digitalização e das corporações, toda a informação de uma comunidade, de uma cidade, de um país, está sendo sugado hoje pelas corporações. Isso diz respeito a todos os nossos segmentos. Então, eu queria cumprimentar aí as nossas organizações por terem reunido esse mosaico, né, essa visão, tentando buscar as forças aí que vão gerando o imaginário coletivo que hoje está sendo, quase como se escapasse das nossas mãos a ideia de que a humanidade quer um mundo melhor para si. Parece escapar, parece que a nossa volta, a humanidade está querendo se agarrar a alguma coisa que não é viável para todo mundo. Então, é isso que eu queria comentar.
Muito obrigada, Rita. Eu vou ler aqui também um comentário que Gibson Silva pediu para ser feito aqui fez no chat, pediu para ser lido. Ele faz uma pergunta no sentido de perguntar, para quem quiser comentar, a gente ainda tem um tempinho, se essa democracia líquida, baseada na tecnologia dos povos, em redes autônomas digitais, pode contribuir para descolonizar a educação, a sociedade e a internet, visando mudanças sociais e um desenvolvimento sustentável. Se sim, se é possível, na avaliação de vocês, o que poderia ser feito? Eu acho que o esforço desse painel todo foi a gente tentar refletir sobre isso, e acho que o conjunto dos nossos convidados aqui, dos nossos debatedores, vem no sentido de entender que sim, né, que a gente pode transformar essas realidades e descolonizar a educação, a sociedade e a internet para buscar as mudanças sociais, e que são inúmeros caminhos. Mas deixo a palavra aberta se algum dos nossos painelistas quiser comentar essa pergunta do Gibson.
Posso falar rapidamente?
Pode, Antônio, por favor.
É interessante essa pergunta, isso que a Rita falou agora, e todos nós, porque é um paradoxo. A gente está numa rede controlada por uma grande corporação falando em como enfrentar uma grande corporação. Então, não deixa de ser contraditório esse momento que a gente vive. É como a gente falar, sou contra a indústria de alimento da carne. Eu, por exemplo, sou vegano, eu acho que a indústria da carne é uma indústria, mas não dá para eu dizer, vamos acabar com o consumo da carne, porque a gente mata os povos de fome. Então, esse paradoxo, ele está na educação, o que chega na acessibilidade, chega já com conteúdos muito deformados, às vezes, como já antecederam. A mesma coisa que dá esse potencial na internet também chupa das comunidades uma cultura, muitas vezes, milenar, coloca essa cultura de forma superficial, torna tudo uma espécie de padrão. Então, eu diria que a resposta é sim e não. Sim, mas contanto que a gente tenha isso que a Rita falou, da iniciativa de fazer, não é simplesmente sim, que boa tecnologia essa de acessibilidade, vamos adotá-la para a melhor ideia do mundo. Não, sim, e vamos lutar cotidianamente por isso nos espaços, porque é isso que é mais importante. Obrigado, Bia.
Eu que agradeço, Antônio. Mais algum debatedor, palestrante, quer fazer un comentario? Beatriu, por favor.
Sí, mira, muy brevemente. Yo, cuando leo este mensaje, encuentro cosas que comparto y otras que me parece que bueno, con las que no estoy de acuerdo porque pienso que es más perpetuar el modelo que tenemos, ¿no? Nos aparece el concepto de desarrollo sostenible. ¿Realmente pensamos que los países del llamado primer mundo que se dedica a explotar al resto de países, pensamos que podemos continuar desarrollándonos y que eso puede ser sostenible? No, para nada. Si continuamos con un desarrollo, vamos a acabar con el planeta. Y eso, la experiencia de Celia, por ejemplo, que ha sido rompedora, o la del compañero palestino, o sea, desde el primer mundo, o sea, desde los países que nos creemos desarrollados, que somos desarrollados a costa de no dejar desarrollar a los demás, no podemos vender la idea, no podemos pretender que el desarrollo puede ser sostenible, porque ese desarrollo se ha basado en la colonización, en la exterminación de pueblos indígenas, en la extracción de los recursos naturales de los otros países. Tenemos que cambiar ese concepto. Y después también, seguro que hay experiencias, lo comentaba Loreto antes, de comunidades que han podido hacer sus propias redes digitales, pero es que hay gente que no tiene electricidad. No podemos poner los esfuerzos en esa democracia que esté basada en tecnologías. Tenemos que poner los esfuerzos en la democracia que está basada en podernos mirar a la cara, en podernos coger de la mano, en poder salir a la calle. Y cuando toda esta pandemia pase, cuando la vacuna esté generalizada, y eso implica porque luchemos para que llegue la vacuna a todos los países del mundo, incluyendo esos que tienen plantas de producción, pero que resulta que igual no podrán acceder a ella, como pasa en la India, por ejemplo. Cuando la vacuna sea generalizada, debemos esforzarnos los movimientos sociales en tejer nuestras redes, utilizando la tecnología si es posible, pero no como algo fundamental. Porque ahora mismo la tecnología, más que acercarnos, nos puede acercar a personas que vivimos en entornos privilegiados, pero realmente lo que hace es separar más al mundo entre quien tiene dinero y quien no lo tiene. Y eso ni desde la educación, ni desde la cultura, ni desde la comunicación, el periodismo, eso no lo podemos permitir.
Este debate tem que começar.
Sim? Mas eu acho, Rita, que o objetivo do Fórum Social Mundial é justamente promover esses encontros e essa miríade de diferentes olhares a partir de diferentes regiões do mundo. Eu acho que a gente teve 2 horas e meia de discussões aqui extremamente ricas, com pessoas de todas as regiões do planeta, com perspectivas diferentes, com lugares de falas diferentes, trazendo não só um diagnóstico muito desafiador do que está acontecendo agora na educação, na comunicação e na cultura, não só a partir da perspectiva do controle de grandes empresas, desses ambientes, mas de políticas públicas e do poder do Estado, que muitas vezes, nesses setores, também viola direitos, mas da resistência que é possível de ser feita. Oscar, acho que quer fazer um último comentário, eu passo para você e depois eu faço o encerramento.
Entonces, por lo menos el último mío. Gracias, Bia. Tal vez pensando en las ricas presentaciones y comentarios que se han dicho hoy, ha sido muy interesante, yo me quedaría con algunos elementos. Primero, el trabajo a nivel integral entre educación, comunicación y cultura, no como áreas separadas, y creo que lo que dice Rita es cierto. Por otro lado, lo que señalaba Antonio y que había notado en el chat François Soulard, la idea de que estamos en una paradoja, pero en una paradoja que tenemos que enfrentar como un desafío. O sea, no estamos en un mundo paralelo, tenemos que construirlo a partir de las condiciones que tenemos como resistencia, pero también como reexistencia. Por eso creo que hay un desafío en ese sentido freiriano, cuando Freire habla de la necesidad de buscar la coherencia entre la utopía y la realidad, entre aquello que queremos que se consiga y lo que vamos haciendo ahora para hacerlo posible. O sea, esa idea de lo inédito viable no es simplemente hacer cualquier cosa diferente, es hacer lo más radical, el cambio más radical posible que se puede hacer ahora, porque eso nos va a dar condiciones para poder generar otro tipo de cambio. Y a la vez, termino diciendo, me parece que no hablamos de un solo camino, hablamos de estrategias que tienen que ser confluyentes, que tienen que retroalimentarse y que por lo tanto desde cada punto de partida tenemos que a partir de esos elementos construir entonces los procesos de cambio con sujetos transformadores. O sea, nuestro trabajo principal es la construcción de la capacidad de transformación en las personas. Y creo que aquí se ha señalado de manera muy, muy rica las distintas posibilidades que hay. Freire decía, la historia no está predeterminada, la historia es una posibilidad. Entonces, este momento de la historia, con todas sus paradojas, es un desafío para construir la historia que queremos que sea posible. Por eso, otra vez la canción, vamos ya a hacer lo que será. Vamos a ir haciendo lo que queremos que sea. Gracias.
Muito obrigada, Oscar. Acho que foi mais uma belíssima citação de Paulo Freire para a gente encerrar o nosso painel. Eu gostaria muitíssimo de agradecer o convite que foi feito para mim para mediar essa mesa. Estou muitíssimo honrada de ter podido passar esse tempo com vocês aqui, ouvir tantas ricas experiências. Agradecer as entidades organizadoras desse painel, CEAL, IPF, Ciranda, Intervozes, APC, Fórum Mundial de Educação, Fórum Mundial de Mídia Livre e também a Claxo. Agradecer o GT, Educação, Comunicação e Cultura deste Fórum Social Mundial. Agradecer as milhares de mãos, braços, corações e mentes que estão por trás da organização desse Fórum Social Mundial. É o primeiro Fórum Social Mundial virtual que está acontecendo. Eu inaugurei a minha vida jornalística trabalhando na cobertura do primeiro Fórum Social Mundial em 2001 em Porto Alegre, então estou muito feliz de poder estar participando dessa edição virtualmente e de rever grandes lutadores e lutadoras deste processo do Fórum Social Mundial. Agradecer na figura da Rosi todos os organizadores do fórum que estão proporcionando
the organization people in the forum. Also like to thank the participants and the interpreters that allowed us to connect ourselves and understand ourselves and build these bridges. I'd like to thank also the hundreds of people who watched us and contributed to the discussion in the chat. The World Social Forum continues throughout this week. We have a very, very large program, so check on the panels and please participate. I wish you a very year of 2021 with a lot of strength. Stay home if possible. Let's have the vaccines as soon as possible, and let's keep connected so we can hug each other again. Thank you all so much. It was an honor. Bye-bye.
Abraços, gente. Grande abraço para todos vocês. Muito obrigada. Obrigada, Bia.
To you all people. Thank you, Bia, for your mediation. It was wonderful. Yeah, Bia was wonderful. A strong hug to you all. Thank you so much for everything.